Hello, learners. Welcome to another lecture in this NPTEL course on Victorian literature. In the previous lecture, we began reading Aurora Leigh by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and we ended by reading this account of the mature Aurora Leigh describing an experience from her early childhood and a description which seemed to reinforce certain stereotypical notions of femininity and masculinity. And I mentioned how that is an indication to the difficult fit between the kind of description of gender and femininity that we will find in this poem and some of the ideas and claims that contemporary 20th or 21st century feminist scholarship has come to associate with this discourse. We will continue reading our poet's self description and understand how this project will be realized by continuing to read from the first book of Aurora Leigh. In the sections that I will read in this lecture, we will read how Aurora Leigh describes her father and introduces the beginning of her education. The education which would ultimately contribute to her development and establishment as a poet. In addition, Aurora Leigh will also describe how, after the loss of both her parents, she moved to England to stay with her aunt. And the process of education, the knowledge that she gained from books, was also very heavily influenced by this changing domestic space in which she was involved. Right? So the stanza that I ended the previous lecture with has a very powerful sentence, which is, "So mothers have God's license to be missed." Right? And I just want to spend some time on this line, on this sentence, because of the way it highlights many of the key themes that will be developed in the book later. The poet ends a long description of how her mother took care of her, and with several instances of what other mothers are better at doing, right? And some instances of those things that mothers are supposedly better at doing are tying sashes, fitting baby shoes, and stringing pretty words that make no sense. Right? Now, this might be a somewhat typical or a narrower than usual minded definition of femininity and motherhood. In addition to that, or such a narrow or supposedly narrow definition of motherhood is justified and universalized by the invocation of a sort of religious authority, right? And the last sentence combines what the poet has just described as maternal or feminine duty by adding the word God, and suggests that mothers have God's license to be missed, right? That there is something religious and divine about the presence of mothers, and when that presence is no longer felt, its absence is also divinely ordained, right? We will return to this invocation of divine authority because Aurora Leigh, the entire narrative, will constantly return to these two powerful themes. First is a sort of feminine or maternal love, and the second is the divine sanction provided by Christianity, and knowing that one's actions are justified and resonate with a vision for humanity that is authorized by religious texts and a divine presence. So, feminine love and divine love, right? These are the two most important themes that shape most of what will happen in Aurora Leigh. And that's why this is an important statement that Elizabeth Barrett Browning's narrator makes. Let us read further and move to what the poet says about her father. "My father was an austere Englishman who, after a dry lifetime spent at home in college learning, law, and parish talk, was flooded with a passion unaware, his whole provisioned and complacent past drowned out from him that moment. As he stood in Florence, where he had come to spend a month, and note the secret of Da Vinci's drains, he musing somewhat absently perhaps some English question, whether men should pay the unpopular but necessary tax with left or right hand, in the alien sun, in that great square of the Santissima, there drifted past him, scarcely marked enough to move his comfortable island scorn, a train of priestly banners, cross and psalm, the white-veiled, rose-crowned maidens holding up tall tapers weighty for such rests, aslant to the blue luminous tremor of the air, and letting drop the white wax as they went to eat the bishop's wafer at the church, from which long trail of chanting priests and girls, a face ashed like a cymbal on his face, and shook with silent clangor brain and heart, transfiguring him to music. Thus, even thus, he too received his sacramental gift with Eucharistic meanings, for he loved, and that's where the poet stops. This is a particularly powerful invocation because it manages to describe several things. It describes the kind of prosaic, mercantile, practical, and somewhat boring concerns that this man brought from England. Right? This educated man, he has college learning, he has some knowledge of law, and he also has some parish talk. Right? These things establish what were the key concerns in England in the early decades of the 19th century. Parish talk and law, that is, the divine right of kingship coexisted with laws that were being debated and formulated in Parliament, not by divinely ordained kings, but by democratically voted and elected representatives. Right? In the midst of this, there was college learning, which was struggling to find the right allegiance between these two very powerful traditional bodies. Right? So here, these are the concerns that this young Englishman brings when he travels to Italy. Right? And he is in Florence. Right? He has gone there to study, right? Because Italy is a historically and culturally very, very prestigious and renowned place. And he has gone to study the secret of Da Vinci's drains. Right? So he's curious about the history of science, mechanics, urban planning, civics, etc. And once there, he also develops some other concerns. He speculates and is energized by some English question, that is, whether men should pay the unpopular or but necessary tax with left or right hand. This is referred to as some English question. There is a hint of condescension in that phrase, some English question, right? Meaning to speculate on taxes, whether taxes are legitimate or not, is somewhat of a misplaced concern in the beautiful Florentine countryside. Right? He could have been focusing on something else, but instead he was focused on this obscure matter. This also reflects the kind of debates, writing, thinking that was going on in England in the 1830s and 40s. Right? Not revolutionary change, but slow, incremental reform. Right? This is the concern that this young man brings while he is in this Italian town. He experiences the alien sun in the great square of the Santissima. And there, around him, what is happening? Around him, activities of the Roman Catholic Church unfolding. Right? What are these activities? Chiefly, it is the sacrament, that is the ritual in which devotees partake of the body of Christ and the blood of Christ in the Eucharist, that is the biscuit and wine that is given by the priest in the church. Right? That activity is taking place around this man. This man, however, is not a part of that culture, so he is somewhat alienated from that culture. And something happens in that culture, not a religious thing, but a somewhat secular and personal thing. While this religious act is taking place, while a lot of devotees are performing this religious ritual, this young man, the poet's father, this Englishman, has an encounter with a woman. Right? He sees a face that flashed like a symbol on his face and shook with silent clangor brain and heart, right? Transfiguring him to music. This is a very unusual and non typical event, an event that is somewhat disjointed and not off a tune with the kind of religious rituals that are unfolding around him. Nonetheless, this is an event that the poet registers and describes with a great deal of feeling and intensity. The language that's used to describe this encounter between this Italian woman and this Englishman, right? It is designed to recreate a powerful emotional experience. Right? We are told that one face flashed on another face like a cymbal. The cymbal is a metal plate, and the sound is quite loud and jarring. It shakes one's senses, right? If a cymbal clashes too close to one's ear, it will leave a very strong impact. It is not exactly a very comforting experience, and it is that experience of being shaken that the poet would like to describe for us. Right? And the effect of this experience on the young man who would eventually become her father is that he's transfigured to music. Right? And this experience, seeing a face being shaken, being moved to music, right? This experience is described as a sacramental gift with Eucharistic meanings, right? And this is the moment that this Englishman falls in love with an Italian woman. And this act of seeing her face and falling in love is likened to the act of eating that tiny wafer, which is given by the priest to devotees in the Roman Catholic Church. The wafer, which is supposed to be the body of Christ, and the sip of the glass of wine, which is supposed to be the blood of Christ. This secular or indifferent Englishman has a religious experience at the moment he encounters this Italian woman. This is how the poet would like to describe and would like readers to imagine how her parents first met. Now, having described this early part of her childhood, the poet moves on and describes her education in two different locations. First, in Italy, that is until her father was alive, and then in England, when after her father's death, the poet moves to his sister, that is her aunt's place in England. This is how the poet describes her education. Good books and bad. I read good books and bad, some bad and good. At once, good aims not always make good books. Well-tempered spades turn up ill-smelling soils, in digging vineyards even. Books that prove God's being so definitely that man's doubt grows self-defined, the other side the line. Made atheist by suggestion, moral books, exasperating to license, genial books, discounting from the human dignity, and merry books which set you weeping when the sun shines, and melancholy books which make you laugh that anyone should weep in this disjointed life for one wrong more. The world of books is still the world I write, and both worlds have God's providence, thank God. To keep and hearten with some struggle indeed among the breakers, some hard swimming through the deeps. I lost breath in my soul sometimes and cried, God save me if there's any God. But even so, God saved me, and being dashed from error on to error, every turn still brought me nearer to the central truth. I thought so. All this anguish in the thick of men's opinions, press and counterpress, now up, now down, now underfoot, now emergent, all the best of it perhaps, but throws you back upon a noble trust, and use your own instinct, merely proves pure reason stronger than bare inference. At strongest, try it, fix against heaven's wall the scaling ladders of school logic. Mount step by step, sight goes faster, that still ray which strikes out from you, how you cannot tell, and why you know not. Did you eliminate that such as you indeed should analyze? Go straight and fast as light and high as God. So, this long passage about the experience of reading books is actually or ends up affirming something much more complex than simply the act of reading books. And this, in a nutshell, is also how the poetic power of Aurora Leigh shapes the experiences and memories that she will write about. In a nutshell, what we witness in this long passage is that the poet begins by ostensibly describing the act of reading different books, the experience of reading different books, and the sort of surprise that one experiences because not all books are written alike. And even when one has a certain expectation, often the experience of reading a book turns out to be quite different. These surprises, these differences, these turbulent experiences, these radically different experiences, they are all combined and unified into a spiritual experience of realizing the presence of God in the disparate particular facts of life that Aurora Leigh finds in her childhood. There are all kinds of books. One cannot predict that the act of reading a book will lead one to a better understanding of the world around her. In fact, one can be sure of the opposite, it seems, that the more one reads, the more one realizes that books do not really describe the world. Rather, books describe something about the author's own opinions or desires or ambitions or fears. So, from realizing the limits of the act of reading to realizing that books are ultimately limited, that books reflect a very pragmatic, practical, and very objective, realistic concern, to realizing that it is possible to feel the presence of God in one's existence. Right? These are three steps, three progressions that Aurora Leigh experiences and ultimately ends with a spiritual affirmation of her instincts and her ambition by realizing that God above is watching her and she exists as someone who is blessed by that divine presence. Right? We will see this concern with divine presence repeated multiple times, and it will affirm for us the deeply religious nature of the poet and this work. But before that, let us read a little more of how Aurora Leigh viewed herself, and even at this early stage, the self who is writing will describe the self who is being remembered in terms of a Victorian sage. At some point during her remembrance of the past, Aurora Leigh is interrupted by herself, and this is how she describes that interruption. "What's this, Aurora Leigh? You write so of the poets and not laugh? Those virtuous liars, dreamers after dark, exaggerators of the sun and moon, and soothsayers in a teacup?" So the skepticism towards books in general and the skepticism towards imaginative or fictional literature in particular reaches a high, reaches a pinnacle, and the mature self, the self who is writing about the self who is remembering herself, that mature self asks a question: why did you not grow skeptical? Why did you not give up on imaginative and fictional writing. Since the goal was to achieve a sort of spiritual resolution, why do you stay confined to this world of fiction and literature? And the self who is being remembered, that self gathers enough intellectual energy and provides a defense of Aurora Leigh's decision to write about her life in verse. Right? She writes, I write so of the only truth tellers now left to God, the only speakers of essential truth, opposed to relative, comparative, and temporal truths, the only holders by his sun skirts through conventional grey dine, and dust the faulty carpets of the world for kings to walk on or our president. The poet suddenly will catch them up with his voice like thunder. This is soul, this is life. This word is being said in heaven. Here's God down on us. What are you about? How all those workers start amid their work. Look round, look up, and feel a moment's space. That carpet dusting, though a pretty trade, is not the imperative labor after all. So, this is a defense of poetry that fails to provide the kind of spiritual resolution that religion or the Eucharist or the Holy Sacrament provides. But despite such failure, poetry has an undeniable strength and an undeniable value. What is that value? It is the power to represent things that may not be completely understood in an accurate, factual, or material manner to the poet. So the poet has a way of getting at the spiritual truth of material things. And in this way, the experience of observing and describing reality in poetry is a sort of religious experience. And the act of writing poetry, Aurora Leigh affirms in this moment, appropriates in the best and most respectable manner possible the spiritual and religious power that the Eucharist and the sacrament appropriate. And how exactly is that going on? And how exactly does Aurora Leigh demonstrate that power? She begins by talking about events that poets write about and the tone with which the poets describe those events, right? So, carpet dusting is a trade, right? There are people whose work is to clean the carpets and to ensure that presidents or kings would walk on them. The poet's work is to observe this act and to ask questions, to make these people wonder if what they are doing is truly valuable, and if so, how does it add value to the shared resources, to the common good that people are sharing with them. And further, the poet raises a voice like thunder and asks questions like, this is soul, this is life. This word is being said in heaven. Here's God down on us. What are you about? Right? This is a spiritual scolding that a material task is subjected to. In addition to a spiritual scolding, the poet also has a socialist and somewhat moralistic stand on society. How all those workers start amid their work. Look around, look up, and feel a moment's space, right? So the workers, some of these workers who are involved in dusting carpets, right? They are confined to a material, laborious task without being provided a spiritual context, without being told a larger story which would connect their individual labor to a universal or cosmic force, right? And it is that connection, it is that act of filling in the blanks, the labor of relating individual acts to cosmic or spiritual truths that the poet performs through the act of observing and putting down in verse these actions. And it is that imperative labor, right? The labor that requires merely physical acts like dusting carpets may be pretty. It may sustain the lives of people. It may help people earn a living. It may achieve a great deal of social and material results, but it is not the imperative labor after all. So you can see in this phrase, it is not the imperative labor. The perspective that the poet takes is the perspective on a laboring class from a very Olympian height, from almost an ivory tower. Right? Here is a poet who is observing the physical labor of other people and is saying that because that labor is not connected to a universal or spiritual force or a cosmic theme, just as the act of eating a wafer and drinking wine in a Roman Catholic Church is connected to the spiritual and material sacrifices that Jesus Christ made for the other believers. Right? The acts of carpet dusting, to name just one of many other acts of physical labor, is somehow less valuable or less imperative, right? That actually shows the kind of intellectual power that Aurora Leigh is trying to consolidate and trying to build towards in this poem. And it also shows the perspective that Elizabeth Barrett Browning is trying to create through the voice of this poet. It is not the perspective of an individual woman writer of the kind we see later on in the work of Charlotte Bronte or other Victorian female writers. The closest that one can get in terms of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's ambitions as a writer is the work of George Eliot. Both George Eliot and Elizabeth Barrett Browning saw themselves as writers first and female or women writers later. And we can see that the way their narrators develop their cultural and narrative authority. They build their authority by appropriating the power and authority of other male narrators, the kind we find in the work of writers like Thomas Carlyle and John Stuart Mill. So, religion again becomes very important, and the description of the inequality, the socialist vision of workers laboring without adequate recognition or dignity, that socialist vision is also subordinated to the desire for a religious and spiritual vision in which all things are connected in God's blessed view. Thank you.